I'm Chef Frank, this is Protocooks, and today we're making my mother-in-law's Irish soda bread. This recipe for soda bread is actually my mother-in-law's recipe that she got from her mother. My mother-in-law and father-in-law are both from Ireland, up Mayo, up Leitrim, and she got this recipe from her mother. And her mother actually lived in the States and was an American citizen. She came over when she was like 18 in the 1920s. She stayed in Philly. She was a cook. She was a domestic. So she cooked, and she probably left around Depression era in the 30s, early 30s. So the funny thing is she cooked on more modern equipment when she came to the States, and then when she moved back home, she was actually baking this in front of a fire or in a hearth, which is like a big open fireplace in her house, rather than having an oven. And she would take the dough and put it into a cast iron pot, put a lid, make sure there was coals underneath it, put some coals on top, and she basically made a little mini oven. Like, that's where Dutch oven comes from. But in this case, it was probably an Irish oven. Soda bread in general is a genre of bread or a type of bread. It's a quick bread. Quick breads are breads that don't need yeast. They get their leavening from baking powder, baking soda. And they're meant to be mixed and baked, and they're fairly quick. You don't have to wait for yeast to rise. So when my mother-in-law was in Ireland when she was a kid, World War II was going on, and they had rations. So they would bake bread rather than buy the bread. They got more for their rations when they got the flour. This bread would probably have a little bit of sugar, but not a lot, and it was not mainly a sweet bread. It was used for kind of everyday bread with some butter, and they'd eat it with their meals. This version, they made this too, but it was more of a sweet bread or a treat. You can see soda breads that are brown breads with whole wheat flour, with raisins, without raisins, with caraway seeds, without caraway seeds. I personally don't like caraway seeds in this. I like the raisins, and I'm not a fan of cooked raisins. I think they have a weird texture to them, but in this bread, I love them. So here's what I have for my mother-in-law's soda bread. All-purpose flour, buttermilk, eggs, shortening, sugar, salt, baking powder and baking soda, and raisins. Before we start making this, I want to talk about some of the ingredients first, right? Buttermilk. When my mother-in-law was young, they would churn their own butter. So they get the heavy cream and they churn it, right? And what comes out of that is the solid butter and then buttermilk. And true buttermilk is more like skim milk. It's thin, right? Because we've kind of churned all the fat out of it. What we use here is a cultured buttermilk. So it's regular milk with some live cultures in it that makes it thick. Now in Ireland, they would probably use more like a sour milk that is closer to this buttermilk in texture. So at the end of the day, if you have buttermilk or you have sour milk or you have the American style buttermilk, use whichever one you want. Another thing I want to talk about in my mother-in-law's recipe is the use of Crisco. So she uses Crisco and margarine. I'm going to use just straight Crisco for this, but you can do a combination of Crisco and margarine. The margarine is adding a little bit of flavor, but it's pretty much just Crisco with a little bit of flavor in it. My wife's grandmother or my mother-in-law's mother used to use butter for this. Here's the thing, Crisco is going to give you a product that lasts a little bit longer. The flavor is not going to be as strong. So I'm just going to use 100% Crisco, and I'll put the butter on later when I actually eat this. So if you want to, you could probably split the Crisco in half and use some whole butter, unsalted butter. But for the most part, I like the texture that the Crisco gives. One note here is that my mother-in-law grew up on a working farm. Like, they would grow a lot of their own food. She tells us about planting the potatoes. So her mother would have their own butter that they made. They would have their own eggs from their own chickens, and they would have their own buttermilk. We don't have a farm, even though everyone thinks that I have my own farm in my backyard. I don't, so I had to buy all this stuff. So you can just imagine that things would probably taste a lot better back then because, they grew a lot of their own stuff. One of the first things I want to do is soak my raisins. I want them to plump up a little and not be so dry. So I'm just going to take some water from the kettle and just cover them and set them aside. Let them come to room temperature, and then we'll strain them out. I'm going to mix all the dry ingredients together. The sugar I'm going to mix with the wet. That goes in with the wet ingredients. The sugar just needs to be dissolved a little, and I don't want it to be grainy in the finished bread, so I consider that one of my wet ingredients. So I have my baking powder, my baking soda, and my salt. And I'm just going to get a whisk and just kind of blend this together, just so that everything's dispersed really well. All right, that's our dry stuff. Set that aside. Next, we're gonna mix our wet ingredients, and this is really simple. Just a couple of eggs, my sugar, and my buttermilk. Okay, whisk that together, combine really well, and make sure the sugar dissolves. Make sure you break up those eggs really good too. All right. Next thing I want to do is cut in my my Crisco or my shortening. And by cutting in, I mean I'm going to take this shortening and I'm just going to get my hands in there. There are special tools for this, but I find my hands work really good. And I think back to when my mother-in-law was doing this, they probably didn't have special tools. They probably were just using their hands anyway. And cutting in is basically coating the starch in the flour with a little bit of the fat. So I'm looking for the size of peas. Right? I'm not trying to get this all warm. I'm just trying to break it up so that it's like pea-sized lumps in here. Good. Okay? And that's what we're looking for. Just like nice and lumpy. The raisins are soaked. We're going to strain them out and try and get off all the excess water. I usually just give them a shake. I don't really want these to be wet going in there. I don't need a ton of moisture in this. It's time to assemble. One thing I want to make sure you have before you assemble is I usually use a piece of parchment paper on a sheet tray. You can use a greased tray too for this if you want to just put some Crisco down or some fat down. I just like the parchment paper. It's easy cleanup. So we're going to assemble. The first thing I want to do is make sure I get all the excess moisture off of my raisins. Give it another shake or two. Get all the water off. And then I throw my raisins in. I don't want to throw these in while they're hot. If the raisins are still hot, let them cool because for the most part, we don't want the raisins melting the fat in the shortening. I give these a quick toss so they get coated in a little bit of the flour. This will make the raisins kind of suspend in the bread rather than just all falling down, okay? Give it a toss so my raisins are coated really well. And then I'm just going to put my liquid in. Get a rubber scraper. Scrape that off. And I'm just going to toss this lightly. I don't want to knead this. This isn't a bread that you want to knead. You want this just to come together. Okay, I have my rubber spatula, but I also have my, my bowl scraper. And I've talked about these in other videos where I bake, but this bowl scraper is probably like $1. And it's one of the best things you can use for when you're making doughs, right? And I'm just going to kind of fold this over. Again, I don't want to mix this really well. I want to just mix it so that it comes together. All right, so once it comes together, again, I didn't mix it all that well. I'm just going to form it into a nice big ball. Right? Make sure I get everything out of my bowl. Give it a nice little plunk down here, right? I'm going to get a little bit of flour just on my hands so that it's not sticky. And I'm going to form this into a loaf. It's a little messy, okay? And I'm going to form it into kind of a tall loaf. This will flatten out. And a little bit of flour on top, like as a dusting, is kind of the way my mother-in-law does it. But I'm just going to form it into kind of a fat loaf. Again, you notice I didn't mix it a lot, right? I'm going to put a little bit of that flour on top just to give it a little dust. So before I bake it, I'm going to put a cross on the top of this. Now, the cross lets the bread actually open up. It gives it a little relief so it doesn't crack. This will let the bread open without cracking. This goes into a preheated oven. I have it at 350 degrees for about 45 minutes to an hour. I'm looking for a nice golden brown, a slightly hollow feel when I tap on it. So let's put it in. It's been almost exactly 45 minutes and the bread is done. I'm going to go get it in a second. But I want to talk about home ovens. My oven is a convection oven, so it circulates the air. You might have a conventional oven, but all home ovens bake at a different rate. So you might need to go for a little more time, a little less time, all depending on your oven. What I suggest is getting to know your oven and how it bakes. So let's go get the bread. Look at that. She's beautifully golden brown, top and bottom. When I tap on her, she sounds a little bit hollow. I also push down in the middle. And what happens is the middle cooks last. So I'm always focusing on, is it cooked all the way through the middle? Is it bouncing back a little? This needs to cool fully before I slice into it, or else it gets really crumbly and falls apart. So what I'm gonna do is let it cool, just like this. It's on a tray on the rack. And when it's cool, we'll slice it, taste it, and see how we did. While I wait for the soda bread to cool, I want to show everyone this beautiful cutting board I got from one of my subscribers who's local to my area. He makes these out of scrap wood. Alex, thank you so much. It's absolutely gorgeous, and we're gonna cut our soda bread on it. This is the first time I'm actually using it. The other thing I want to talk about is the type of butter that I'm gonna use to slather on this soda bread, because I like a lot of butter on my soda bread. I'm using Kerrygold. I'm not sponsored by them, but I would love for them to sponsor me. It's Irish butter, and it's absolutely delicious. Get the salted one, and that's the best butter I feel to put on this bread. All right, the bread is mostly cool. I can't wait any longer. I'm a little impatient. So let's get this onto my cutting board, okay? I have a nice serrated knife here because it's a very tender bread, so the serrations will help us not tear it apart. All right, here's the moment of truth. Look at that. All right, I'm gonna cut a slice off. Now, I'm gonna put the rest of the loaf over here. I mean, it's still warm, so it's a little crumbly, but I don't have a lot of patience here. All right. Cut it. Get some of my beautiful Irish butter. And I'm not shy about the butter on this. I like lots of butter. My wife cringes whenever I eat this, okay? Look how crumbly it is, it's still hot. I love it. It has a little sweetness, but it's not super sweet. And again, I don't really like cooked raisins, but in this it really works. I hope you try this. It's delicious. I think my mother-in-law will be happy with it. My wife's gonna bring some over later today, so we'll see if I get a thumbs up or a thumbs down. I still haven't been able to get it as good as hers, but I'm getting close. Maybe I have another 20 years before I get it right. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, give us a thumbs up, like, subscribe, hit the little bell to get notified when we have new videos. We have merch in the link down below, Need Salt t-shirts, totes, cups, mugs, crazy stuff like that. I want to thank our patrons on Patreon for supporting us. We have an address down below if you ever want to send us anything. It's a P.O. box. And that's it. Irish soda bread. I'm Chef Frank. This is Protocooks. Have a great day.